The rattlesnake coiled around Evangeline Thorne's wrist like a living bracelet as she stepped off the stagecoach into the dusty street of Silver Ridge, Montana territory. And the three women waiting near the general store let out shrieks that could have shattered glass. "Sweet Jesus, preserve us!" the eldest woman gasped, clutching her reticule to her chest. "She keeps snakes as pets!" The other two women scrambled backward, their skirts kicking up clouds of dirt in their haste to distance themselves from the newcomer. Evangeline stood perfectly still, letting the September sun of 1876 warm her face as she gently unwound the snake from her arm and placed it carefully into a ventilated wooden box she carried. The snake was docile, accustomed to her handling, and slithered contentedly into the container lined with soft cloth. "They are not dangerous, if you understand them," Evangeline said calmly, her voice carrying the refined accent of an Eastern education. She was 23 years old, tall and slender, with rich auburn hair pinned beneath a practical traveling hat, and green eyes that held both intelligence and wariness. She wore a split riding skirt and boots rather than the impractical dresses favored by most women, and her gloved hands moved with confidence as she secured the latch on the box. From across the street, leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon, a man watched the commotion with interest. Josiah Brennan was a mountain man through and through. Though at 30 years old, he had spent the last 2 months in Silver Ridge trading furs and restocking supplies before heading back into the high country. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt and arms thick with muscle from years of survival in the wilderness. His hair, dark brown and streaked with sun-touched lighter strands, hung past his shoulders, and a full beard covered the lower half of his weathered face. His eyes, pale blue like glacier ice, narrowed with curiosity as he observed the strange woman and her even stranger cargo. "Good," he said, his deep voice carrying across the street despite being barely above normal speaking volume. "She ain't afraid of nothing." The three women turned toward him, scandalized expressions on their faces. "Mr. Brennan, surely you cannot approve of such unnatural behavior," the eldest protested. "A woman keeping serpents, it is against all propriety and decency." Josiah pushed away from the hitching post, his movements economical and predatory despite his size. "Seems to me a woman who can handle a rattler without flinching has more backbone than most men I have met in these parts, Mrs. Henderson. I would call that a quality worth respecting rather than condemning." He walked toward Evangeline, and she turned to face him fully, her chin lifting in what he recognized as both defiance and assessment. She was measuring him just as he was measuring her, and he found himself appreciating the directness in her gaze. "I am Josiah Brennan," he said, touching the brim of his worn leather hat. "Welcome to Silver Ridge, miss." "Evangeline Thorne," she replied, shifting her box to rest against her hip so she could extend her hand. "I appreciate your defense of my character, Mr. Brennan, though I fear it may be wasted on those already determined to disapprove of me." Her handshake was firm, and Josiah noted the calluses on her palm even through the thin leather of her gloves. This was not a woman accustomed to idleness. "May I ask what brings a snake-keeping woman to Montana territory?" he asked, genuine curiosity coloring his tone. Evangeline's expression became guarded. "I am a naturalist, Mr. Brennan. I study reptiles and their behaviors. I have accepted a position documenting the various snake species in this region for a scientific journal based in Boston. I will be here for at least a year, possibly longer depending on my findings." A murmur of dismay rose from the small crowd that had begun to gather. The frontier was no place for a woman alone, especially not one with such peculiar occupations. Josiah saw the mixture of curiosity and hostility in the faces around them, and recognized the danger inherent in such attention. A woman like Evangeline Thorne would either be accepted into the community or driven out of it, and the next few minutes would likely determine which fate awaited her. "You have lodgings arranged?" he asked. "I was informed there's a boarding house run by a Mrs. Carmichael," Evangeline said. "I've corresponded with her and sent payment in advance for the first month." Mrs. Henderson made a choking sound. "Martha Carmichael will never allow snakes under her roof. It is unthinkable." As if summoned by the mention of her name, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and a face like carved granite emerged from a building down the street. Martha Carmichael had run the only boarding house in Silver Ridge for 15 years, and her word carried considerable weight in the small community. "I heard the shrieking all the way from my kitchen," Mrs. Carmichael announced, her voice brooking no nonsense. "What is all this commotion about?" "This woman keeps snakes," one of the younger women exclaimed, pointing at Evangeline as though she were a curiosity in a traveling show. "Live snakes as pets?" Mrs. Carmichael's sharp eyes fixed on Evangeline, then on the box she carried, then finally on Evangeline's face. The older woman crossed her arms over her ample bosom and studied the newcomer for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Are they venomous?" Mrs. Carmichael asked bluntly. "Some are," Evangeline replied with equal bluntness. "I take extensive precautions. They are kept in secure containers with locks. I have handled snakes for 6 years without incident. I would never allow any creature in my care to pose a danger to others." "Why snakes?" Mrs. Carmichael asked. "Why not butterflies or birds or some other creature that does not inspire such dread?" Evangeline's green eyes flashed with passion. "Because snakes are misunderstood and unjustly maligned, Mrs. Carmichael. They serve vital purposes in controlling rodent populations and maintaining ecological balance. They are fascinating creatures with complex behaviors that deserve study and respect rather than fear and destruction. I wish to document their habits and contribute to scientific knowledge that might help people see them as something other than monsters to be killed on sight." A smile tugged at the corner of Mrs. Carmichael's stern mouth. "You have fire in you, girl. I respect that. You may stay in my boarding house under the following conditions. The snakes remain in your room at all times unless you are taking them out for your studies. The containers must be escape-proof and will be inspected regularly. And if I find so much as a garter snake loose in my hallways, you will be out on your ear before you can say Jack Robinson. Understood?" Relief flooded Evangeline's features. "Understood completely, Mrs. Carmichael. Thank you. You will not regret this decision." "I had better not," Mrs. Carmichael said dryly. "Come along then. Let me show you to your room. Mr. Brennan, make yourself useful and bring the young lady's trunk, would you?" Josiah found himself grinning beneath his beard as he retrieved Evangeline's travel-worn trunk from where the stagecoach driver had deposited it. The trunk was surprisingly heavy, no doubt filled with scientific equipment and books rather than the fripperies most women traveled with. He hoisted it onto his shoulder with ease, aware of Evangeline watching him from the corner of her eye, and followed the two women down the street. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with a wide porch and neat flower boxes in the windows. Inside, it was clean and simply furnished, with the faint scent of baking bread drifting from the back of the house. Mrs. Carmichael led them up a narrow staircase to the second floor and opened the door to a corner room that overlooked the main street. "This is the largest room I have available," Mrs. Carmichael said. "It gets good light from both windows, which I suspect will be useful for your work. Meals are served at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. If you miss a meal, you fend for yourself. Baths are Saturday evenings. Rent is due on the 1st of each month. Any questions?" "None, Mrs. Carmichael. This is perfect," Evangeline said, setting her box carefully on the sturdy table near one window. "You are most kind to give me this opportunity." "I am not kind," Mrs. Carmichael corrected. "I am practical. You paid in advance and you seem like a woman with sense, despite your peculiar profession. Do not prove me wrong." After Mrs. Carmichael departed with a final warning look, Josiah set the trunk down near the bed. The room was simple but comfortable, with a brass bedstead covered in a worn quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a wardrobe, and the table where Evangeline had placed her snake box. She was already unpacking, her movements efficient, as she began setting up what appeared to be a larger enclosure near the window. "You will need someone to guide you in the high country if you intend to search for snakes in their natural habitats," Josiah said. "Montana Territory is unforgiving to those who do not know its ways." Evangeline paused in her unpacking and turned to face him. "Are you offering your services, Mr. Brennan?" "I am. I know these mountains better than most. I can take you to places where few white people have ventured, places where the snakes you seek are plentiful and undisturbed. I can also keep you alive while you conduct your studies, which strikes me as equally important." "And what would you require as payment?" Evangeline asked, her tone carefully neutral. Josiah considered. He had planned to return to his cabin in the high country soon, but something about this unusual woman intrigued him. She had a courage that went beyond mere stubbornness, a genuine passion for her work that reminded him of why he himself preferred the wilderness to civilization. The mountains had their own rhythms and rules, and he suspected Evangeline Thorne would appreciate them once she experienced them. "Standard guide rates," he said, $2 a day plus food and any necessary supplies. I provide transportation, protection, and knowledge of the terrain. You provide your own equipment for your snake hunting." "That seems reasonable," Evangeline said. "When can we begin?" "You just arrived," Josiah pointed out. "Do you not wish to rest and settle in first?" "I have been sitting in a stagecoach for 3 days, Mr. Brennan. The last thing I wish to do is sit still any longer. If you are willing, I would like to make a preliminary expedition tomorrow to familiarize myself with the local terrain and begin identifying promising locations for study." Josiah found himself grinning again. "Tomorrow it is, then. I will come by at first light, wear sturdy boots, and bring water. The sun up here is more intense than you are likely accustomed to in the east." "I'm quite capable of managing myself, Mr. Brennan," Evangeline said, but there was amusement rather than offense in her voice. "I am beginning to see that, Miss Thorne," Josiah replied. He touched his hat brim again in farewell and left her to her unpacking, aware that his plans for a quiet autumn in the mountains had just become considerably more interesting. That evening, Josiah sat in the saloon, nursing a whiskey and fielding questions from the other men about the strange woman with the snakes. Most of the talk was dismissive or crude, the kind of comments men made when confronted with something that challenged their understanding of how women should behave. "She will not last a week," predicted Frank Morrison, who ran the general store. "First time she sees a grizzly or a mountain lion, she will be on the next stage back to wherever she came from." "I heard she went to university," another man said with disbelief. "What kind of family lets their daughter go to university? It ain't natural." Josiah kept his opinions to himself, listening to the talk with growing irritation. He had seen men crumble in the wilderness while women thrived. Survival had little to do with gender and everything to do with adaptability, intelligence, and determination. Evangeline Thorne possessed all 3 qualities in abundance, he suspected, though time would tell whether his assessment was accurate. He finished his whiskey and headed to the small room he rented above the livery stable. Tomorrow would come early, and he wanted to be prepared. If Miss Thorne was serious about studying snakes in their natural habitats, he would take her to the rocky slopes north of town, where rattlesnakes sunned themselves on the warm stones. It would be a good test of her commitment and her competence. Evangeline spent the evening setting up her equipment and making notes in her journal by lamplight. She had 3 snakes with her currently: the rattlesnake that had caused such commotion earlier, a garter snake she had caught in Wyoming territory during her journey west, and a bull snake she had acquired from a farmer who had been about to kill it. All 3 were housed in secure wooden enclosures with screened ventilation and latches that required human dexterity to open. She fed them, checked their water, and recorded observations about their behavior before finally allowing herself to sit on the bed. The mattress was lumpy but infinitely better than the stagecoach seat. Through the window, she could hear the sounds of Silver Ridge settling into night, music and laughter from the saloon, the occasional bark of a dog, the distant call of an owl. This was so different from Boston, from the gaslit streets and the university halls where she had fought so hard to be taken seriously as a scientist rather than dismissed as an eccentric woman with unsuitable interests. She thought about Josiah Brennan and found herself unexpectedly curious about him. He was unlike any man she had encountered in her eastern circles. There was a raw competence about him, a sense that he was entirely comfortable in his own skin and needed no one's approval. He had defended her without condescension, had offered his services without ulterior motive, and had treated her work with respect rather than mockery. It was refreshing and also slightly unsettling, because Evangeline was accustomed to fighting for every scrap of recognition and did not quite know how to respond when it was offered freely. She undressed and washed using the cold water in the pitcher, then climbed into bed in her nightgown. Tomorrow would be her first real day in Montana territory, her first opportunity to explore the landscape she had traveled so far to study. Excitement thrummed through her veins, making sleep difficult despite her exhaustion. Eventually, she drifted off to the sound of wind whistling past the eaves, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant snow. True to his word, Josiah knocked on the boarding house door just as the eastern sky was turning from black to deep blue. Mrs. Carmichael answered, already dressed and radiating efficiency despite the early hour, and directed him to the dining room where Evangeline sat, eating a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "Good morning, Mr. Brennan," Evangeline said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Will you join me? Mrs. Carmichael has prepared enough food to feed an army." Josiah accepted gratefully, and Mrs. Carmichael brought him a loaded plate without comment. He ate methodically, noting that Evangeline matched him bite for bite rather than picking at her food as so many women did. She had dressed for practicality in a divided skirt, a simple blouse, and a leather vest. Her hair was braided and pinned close to her head, and she wore a wide-brimmed hat that would provide protection from the sun. "You have a horse?" he asked between bites. "I do not," Evangeline admitted. "I had hoped to purchase one here, but I have not yet had the opportunity." "I brought two," Josiah said. "You can ride one of mine today. If you decide to continue with these expeditions, we will acquire a suitable mount for you." After breakfast, they walked to the livery stable where Josiah kept his horses. He had a massive bay gelding named Bear that stood nearly 17 hands high and a smaller but sturdy paint mare named Willow. He saddled both animals with the ease of long practice, adjusting the stirrups on Willow to accommodate Evangeline's height. "She is gentle but not stupid," Josiah said, stroking the mare's neck. "She will respond to a light hand and will warn you if she senses danger. Trust her instincts." Evangeline approached the horse confidently, letting Willow sniff her hand before mounting smoothly. She sat the saddle well, her posture indicating previous riding experience, and Josiah felt a measure of relief. A greenhorn on horseback was a liability in rough terrain. They rode out of Silver Ridge as the sun crested the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and pine. Josiah led the way along a trail that wound through stands of ponderosa pine and across meadows where late-season wildflowers still bloomed in defiant splashes of color. Evangeline rode beside him when the trail widened, her eyes constantly moving as she took in every detail of the landscape. "What snake species do you expect to find in this area?" Josiah asked. "Based on my research, I anticipate several varieties of rattlesnake, garter snakes, gopher snakes, and possibly rubber boas in the higher elevations," Evangeline replied. "I am particularly interested in documenting the behavioral differences between rattlesnakes in this region and those I studied in the Southwest. Climate and prey availability can significantly influence hunting patterns and social interactions." "Social interactions?" Josiah raised an eyebrow. "Snakes are social creatures?" "More than most people realize," Evangeline said, warming to her subject. "Rattlesnakes, for instance, often den communally during winter and have been observed returning to the same den sites year after year. Mothers provide protection for their young after birth, which contradicts the common belief that snakes simply abandon their offspring. There is evidence of complex chemical communication and even what might be considered cooperative behavior in some species." Josiah found himself genuinely interested as Evangeline continued to explain her work. She spoke with passion and precision, her scientific knowledge evident, but her explanations clear enough for a layman to understand. He had spent years observing animal behavior in the wild and recognized a kindred spirit in this unusual woman who saw beauty and complexity where others saw only danger. They reached the rocky slopes he had in mind by mid-morning. The south-facing hillside was littered with flat stones that absorbed and radiated heat, creating ideal basking spots for cold-blooded creatures. Josiah tied the horses in the shade of a juniper and helped Evangeline unload her equipment, a leather satchel containing notebooks, pencils, measuring tools, and a specialized hook for safely handling snakes, along with several cloth bags for temporarily containing specimens she wished to examine more closely. "Stay close," Josiah instructed. "Watch where you put your hands and feet. Make noise as you move so you do not surprise anything that might be resting in the shade." "Sound advice," Evangeline agreed. "Despite what people think, snakes do not wish to bite humans. We are too large to eat and too dangerous to trifle with. Most bites occur when people accidentally step on or corner a snake, giving it no option but to defend itself. They moved slowly across the slope, examining likely hiding spots and basking areas. Josiah was impressed by Evangeline's patience and thoroughness. She did not rush or make careless movements, and she seemed to have an instinct for where snakes might be found. Within an hour, she had located and documented 3 different rattlesnakes, each one photographed in her mind's eye as she sketched its markings and made detailed notes about its size, coloration, and behavior. "This one is gravid," Evangeline said softly, observing a particularly large female from a respectful distance. "See how thick she is through the middle? She will give birth soon, probably seeking shelter as temperatures begin to drop. Rattlesnakes give live birth rather than laying eggs, which allows them to survive in colder climates than many other snake species." Josiah crouched beside her, following her pointing finger to observe the snake in question. The rattlesnake was indeed impressive, nearly 4 feet long with beautiful diamond patterning along her back. She lay coiled on a flat rock, soaking up the sun's warmth, her tongue occasionally flicking out to taste the air. "She is beautiful," he said, surprising himself with the admission. Evangeline turned to look at him, her green eyes bright with pleasure. "She is, isn't she? Most people cannot see past their fear to appreciate the elegance of a snake's form and movement. I am glad you can." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared vision despite their different backgrounds and experiences. Josiah felt it like a physical thing, a warmth that had nothing to do with the September sun beating down on the rocks. He cleared his throat and stood, offering Evangeline his hand to help her rise. "We should move on," he said. "There's more ground to cover if you wish to get a comprehensive view of the area." They worked their way across the slope for several more hours, stopping occasionally to rest in the shade and drink from the canteens Josiah had brought. Evangeline asked him questions about his life in the mountains, and he found himself talking more freely than was his custom. He told her about his cabin in the high country, about trapping and hunting and surviving through brutal winters when the snow piled higher than a man's head. He told her about tracking grizzlies and wolves, about the delicate balance of predator and prey, about the harsh beauty of a landscape that cared nothing for human concerns. In turn, Evangeline told him about growing up in Boston, the daughter of a professor who had encouraged her curiosity even as society frowned upon her interests. She told him about fighting to audit university classes, about the mockery and obstacles she had faced, about the determination that had driven her to pursue scientific knowledge despite every discouragement. She spoke of her mother's death when she was 16, of her father's remarriage to a woman who considered Evangeline's interests unseemly, of her eventual decision to strike out on her own and make a name for herself through her research. "I will not be remembered as someone's daughter or someone's wife," Evangeline said fiercely. "I will be remembered for my contributions to science, for my own work and my own discoveries. That is what matters to me." Josiah heard the pain beneath her determination and respected it. "You do not wish to marry?" "I do not say that," Evangeline replied carefully. "But I will not marry simply because it is expected of me, and I will not marry a man who expects me to abandon my work to serve his ambitions. If I ever marry, it will be to a partner who respects my mind and my passions as much as I respect his." "That seems reasonable," Josiah said, "though I suspect such men are rare." "Hence my continued unmarried state," Evangeline said with a wry smile. They returned to Silver Ridge in the late afternoon, both sunburned despite their precautions and pleasantly exhausted. Josiah helped Evangeline unsaddle Willow and brush her down, noting how gently she handled the horse and how Willow responded with trust. "Same time tomorrow?" Evangeline asked as they walked back toward the boarding house. "If you are not too sore from riding," Josiah said. "It has been some time since you sat a horse for that long, I would wager." "I will manage," Evangeline assured him. "This is too important to let a little discomfort slow me down." Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself. Josiah and Evangeline rode out each morning, exploring different areas of the territory and documenting the snakes they encountered. Evangeline's collection grew as she temporarily captured specimens for closer study before releasing them back into their habitats. She made detailed sketches and notes, building a comprehensive record of rattlesnake populations and behaviors in the region. Josiah found himself looking forward to their expeditions with an eagerness that surprised him. He had always been solitary by nature, preferring the company of animals and wilderness to people, but Evangeline's presence felt natural rather than intrusive. She was quiet when silence was appropriate, conversational when the moment called for it, and observant in ways that matched his own awareness of their surroundings. She asked intelligent questions, and actually listened to his answers, treating his knowledge with the same respect he gave to her scientific expertise. The people of Silver Ridge gradually grew accustomed to seeing them ride out together each morning. Gossip was inevitable in a small town, but Mrs. Carmichael's approval of the arrangement provided a measure of protection for Evangeline's reputation. The older woman had taken a liking to her unusual boarder and defended her against the worst of the wagging tongues. "That girl has more backbone than half the men in this town," Mrs. Carmichael declared to anyone who would listen, "and Josiah Brennan is a gentleman despite his rough exterior. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." As October arrived and the aspens turned gold against the evergreen slopes, Josiah realized he was falling in love. It crept up on him gradually, like the turning of the seasons, until one morning he woke up and understood that the tightness in his chest when he saw Evangeline had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with his heart. He tried to fight it. She had made her priorities clear, and he had no business disrupting them with his own wants and needs. She was meant for a world of universities and scientific journals, not for a rough mountain man who could barely write his own name. But the heart, he discovered, paid little attention to logic or propriety. Evangeline, for her part, found her own feelings growing complicated. She had come to Montana Territory for professional reasons, seeking to advance her career and contribute to scientific knowledge. Romance had not been part of her plans, but Josiah Brennan had worked his way past her defenses with his quiet competence and genuine respect for her work. He never condescended to her, never treated her as fragile or foolish, never tried to dissuade her from pursuing her goals. Instead, he supported her work practically and enthusiastically, pointing out promising locations and sharing his vast knowledge of animal behavior. More than that, she found herself drawn to him physically in ways that took her by surprise. The strength in his arms when he lifted her onto her horse, the solid warmth of his presence when they sat side by side observing snakes, the rare but devastating smile that transformed his bearded face from stern to boyishly handsome. She caught herself watching the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he worked, imagining what it might feel like to be held in those powerful arms, and the direction of her thoughts alarmed her. The crisis came in late October, when an early snowstorm caught them in the high country. They had ridden farther than usual, following reports of a massive den site where hundreds of rattlesnakes gathered to overwinter. Evangeline was eager to document the site before the snakes went fully dormant, and Josiah had reluctantly agreed, despite the threatening sky. They found the den in a rocky outcropping riddled with deep crevices, and Evangeline was so excited by the sheer number of snakes visible that she lost track of time. Josiah kept a wary eye on the weather, noting the way the wind had shifted and the particular quality of the clouds building over the peaks. "We need to leave," he said finally. "Now, Evangeline. A storm is coming, and we do not want to be caught up here when it hits." Evangeline reluctantly packed her equipment, casting longing glances back at the den site. Can we return in the spring when they emerge? The mating behaviors would be fascinating to document. If we survive the ride back to town, we can discuss spring expeditions, Josiah said grimly. Mount up. They were halfway down the mountain when the snow began. It started as scattered flakes, but quickly intensified into a blinding curtain of white. The temperature plummeted, and the wind picked up until it howled through the pines like a living thing. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and Josiah realized they would not make it back to Silver Ridge before dark. "There's a line shack about 2 miles east of here," he shouted over the wind. "We will shelter there until the storm passes." Evangeline nodded, trusting his judgment completely. She could barely see Willow's ears in front of her, let alone the trail, but she felt the mare following Bear's lead and concentrated on staying in the saddle. Her hands were numb despite her gloves, and she could no longer feel her feet in the stirrups. The cold cut through her clothes like knives, and she began to understand why Josiah had been so insistent about leaving when he did. The line shack materialized out of the white like a miracle. It was a small structure, barely large enough for 2 people, but it had a roof and walls and a door that closed against the storm. Josiah dismounted and led both horses around to the sheltered side of the shack where a lean-to provided minimal protection. He unsaddled them quickly, his movements economical despite the conditions, and hauled the saddles and gear inside before helping Evangeline down from Willow's back. She stumbled when her feet hit the ground, her legs refusing to support her properly. Josiah caught her easily and half-carried her into the shack, kicking the door shut behind them. Inside, it was dark and smelled of old wood and mice, but it was blessedly out of the wind. "Can you move your fingers and toes?" Josiah asked urgently, setting her on the narrow bunk that took up one wall. "I think so," Evangeline said through chattering teeth. "Everything is numb." Josiah lit a small fire in the stone fireplace, nursing the flames carefully with kindling from a box by the hearth. When it was burning steadily, he turned his attention back to Evangeline, pulling off her gloves and boots to check for frostbite. Her fingers and toes were white and cold, but began to pink up as he rubbed them gently. "You're going to be all right," he said. "No permanent damage, but you gave me a scare." "I am sorry," Evangeline said, beginning to recover as warmth seeped back into her extremities. "I should have paid better attention to the weather." "I should not have taken you up so high this late in the season," Josiah countered. "The fault is mine." "We could argue about whose fault it is, or we could acknowledge that we are both stubborn, and neither of us wanted to turn back when we did," Evangeline suggested, attempting a smile. "Thank you for getting us here safely." Josiah moved away to check their supplies. The line shack was stocked with basic provisions for emergencies: flour, salt pork, coffee, and matches. He had the canteens from their saddlebags and some jerky and hardtack. It was not luxurious, but they would not starve. The storm raged outside, the wind shrieking around the corners of the shack and snow piling against the door. Josiah mixed up basic biscuits and cooked them in a pan over the fire, while Evangeline huddled in the blankets from his bedroll, watching him work. "You are very competent," she observed. "I feel quite useless in comparison." "You are a scientist, not a frontiersman," Josiah said. "You have your skills, I have mine. Together, we make a good team." "We do, don't we?" Evangeline said softly. "I have enjoyed these weeks more than I expected to, Josiah. Your company has been important to me." He looked up from the biscuits, his pale eyes searching her face in the firelight. "Important how?" Evangeline hesitated, aware that she stood at a crossroads. She could deflect and maintain the professional boundaries they had carefully observed, or she could tell the truth and see where it led them. "Important in ways I did not anticipate when I came here," she said carefully. "I came to Montana to advance my career, to conduct research that would establish my reputation as a serious scientist. I did not expect to find someone who understood me so well, who saw my work as valuable rather than eccentric. I did not expect to feel what?" Josiah prompted when she trailed off. "Connected," Evangeline finished. "I feel connected to you in ways I have never experienced with anyone else. It frightens me because it was not part of my plan, and I have always relied on having a plan." Josiah abandoned the biscuits and crossed to the bunk, sitting beside her in the small space. "Plans change," he said quietly. "Life throws storms at us whether we are prepared or not. The question is whether we face them alone or together." "I do not know how to do this," Evangeline admitted. "I have always been alone, always fought my own battles. I do not know how to let someone in without losing myself in the process." "Then we learn together," Josiah said, "because I am in the same boat, Evangeline. I have been alone in these mountains for 10 years, and I thought I preferred it that way. Then you arrived with your snakes and your courage and your brilliant mind, and suddenly alone feels like the last thing I want to be." He reached up to cup her face in his rough palm, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I am not a man of pretty words or fancy manners. I cannot give you a life in Boston or an easy path to scientific recognition, but I can give you honesty and respect, and whatever parts of my heart you are willing to accept. If that is enough, then say so. If it is not, I will understand, and we will go back to the way things were." Evangeline leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his face. She saw raw vulnerability there, this strong man who faced grizzlies without flinching, but trembled slightly as he waited for her answer. "It is more than enough," she whispered. "It is everything I did not know I needed." He kissed her then, gentle at first and then with growing intensity as she responded. The storm howled outside, but inside the line shack there was only warmth and connection and the overwhelming sense of rightness that comes when two people finally stop fighting what their hearts have known all along. They broke apart eventually, both breathing hard, and Josiah rested his forehead against hers. "We should eat something," he said, "and rest. The storm may blow for hours yet." They ate the biscuits and jerky in companionable silence, sitting close together for warmth. As the afternoon wore into evening and the storm showed no signs of abating, they lay down together on the narrow bunk, wrapped in blankets in each other's arms. It was innocent by necessity, the circumstances not lending themselves to anything more intimate, but the emotional intimacy was profound. "Tell me about your cabin," Evangeline said, her head pillowed on Josiah's broad chest. "What is it like?" "Small," Josiah said, his deep voice rumbling beneath her ear. "One room, a loft for sleeping, a good fireplace. There's a stream nearby with cold, clear water and meadows where elk graze in the evenings. The silence is so deep you can hear your own heartbeat. In winter, the snow is over your head, and you see no other human soul for months at a time. In summer, the wildflowers cover everything and the days last forever." "It sounds lonely," Evangeline observed. "It was," Josiah admitted. "I told myself I preferred it that way, that I had no use for people and their complications. But it was not preference so much as protection, I suppose. After my family died, I could not bear to be around others, to see their pity or their discomfort with my grief. The mountains asked nothing of me except survival, and that seemed like a fair trade." "What happened to your family?" Evangeline asked gently. "Cholera," Josiah said flatly. "My parents, my two sisters, gone within a week. I was 20 years old and suddenly alone in the world. I could not stay in the places that reminded me of them, so I headed west and kept going until I ran out of west. I found these mountains and they gave me what I needed: space to grieve, challenges to keep me alive, beauty that reminded me the world was still worth experiencing even without the people I loved." Evangeline tightened her arms around him. "I'm so sorry." "It was a long time ago," Josiah said. "I've made my peace with it, but it shaped who I became, for better or worse." "I understand that," Evangeline said. "My mother's death shaped me too. She was the one who encouraged my curiosity, who saw no reason why a girl could not study science just as readily as a boy. When she died, I lost my greatest advocate. My father remarried within the year to a woman who thought my interests were unseemly and tried her best to mold me into a proper young lady. We fought constantly. I left for university as soon as I was old enough, determined to prove I could make my own way in the world." "You have certainly done that," Josiah said with admiration in his voice. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met, Evangeline Thorne." "I do not always feel brave," she confessed. "Sometimes I feel terrified that I have made the wrong choices, that I will end up old and alone with nothing but my research to keep me company." "You will not be alone," Josiah said firmly. "Not anymore. Not if you do not wish to be." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other as the storm gradually blew itself out. When Evangeline woke in the gray light of early morning, she felt Josiah's steady heartbeat beneath her cheek and experienced a sense of peace she had not known in years. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt like she had found something more valuable than scientific data or professional recognition. She had found home. The ride back to Silver Ridge was cold but clear, the world transformed into a pristine wonderland of white. The horses picked their way carefully through the fresh snow, and both riders were grateful when the buildings of town appeared in the distance. Mrs. Carmichael met them at the boarding house door, her face tight with worry that relaxed into relief when she saw them. "Thank the Lord," she said. "I was about to organize a search party. Come in, both of you. You look half frozen." She bustled them inside and immediately set about heating water for baths and preparing hot food. While Evangeline soaked in the tub upstairs, warming her chilled bones, Mrs. Carmichael cornered Josiah in the kitchen. "I hope your intentions toward that girl are honorable," she said bluntly, "because if they are not, you and I are going to have words." Josiah met her gaze steadily. My intentions are entirely honorable, Mrs. Carmichael. I love her. I plan to marry her if she will have me. Mrs. Carmichael's stern expression softened. Good. She needs someone who will support her work rather than trying to change her. And you need someone to remind you that there is more to life than solitude in the mountains. You are well matched, I think. I think so too, Josiah agreed. But there are complications. She has her research to complete, her reputation to build. I will not ask her to give up her dreams for my sake. Have you considered that perhaps her dreams might include you now? Mrs. Carmichael suggested. Talk to her, Josiah. Be honest about what you want and what you can offer. Let her make her own decisions about what matters most to her. Over the next few weeks, as winter began to settle in earnest over Montana territory, Josiah and Evangeline navigated the new territory of their relationship. They continued their expeditions when weather permitted, though the snakes were increasingly dormant as temperatures dropped. They spent evenings in the boarding house parlor, Evangeline writing up her research notes while Josiah carved or repaired gear, both simply enjoying each other's company. The people of Silver Ridge grew accustomed to seeing them together, and speculation ran rampant about when they would announce an engagement. Josiah knew the gossip bothered Evangeline, not because she was ashamed of their relationship, but because she worried about her scientific reputation. Women in her field already faced tremendous skepticism, and any hint of impropriety could destroy the credibility she had worked so hard to build. Let them talk, Josiah told her one evening as they sat before the fire in Mrs. Carmichael's parlor. You know the truth of your work and your character. Anyone who matters will judge you on your research, not on small-town gossip. I wish I had your confidence, Evangeline sighed, but I've fought too long to establish myself to risk it all on careless behavior. I must complete my research and publish my findings before I can consider other aspects of my future. I am not asking you to abandon your work, Josiah said gently. I would never ask that of you. But neither can I pretend I do not want a future with you that includes more than occasional expeditions and chaperoned evenings in a boarding house parlor. Evangeline set down her pen and turned to face him fully. What are you asking, Josiah? Be specific. He took a deep breath. I am asking you to marry me, not right away, not until you are ready. But I want you to know that is my intention, that I am committed to building a life with you in whatever form that takes. If you need to finish your research first, I will wait. If you need to return to Boston to submit your findings, I will wait. But I am asking you to consider making your life here, with me, when the time is right. Tears pricked at Evangeline's eyes. You would wait? Even if it takes months or longer? I would wait years if necessary, Josiah said simply. You are worth waiting for. I do not deserve you, Evangeline whispered. That is where you are wrong, Josiah said, pulling her into his arms. We deserve each other. We are both stubborn, independent people who thought we were better off alone. Finding each other against all odds seems like more than luck. It seems like fate. Evangeline buried her face against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. Yes, she said, her voice muffled by his shirt. Yes, I will marry you. But you are right that the timing must be considered carefully. I need to complete at least the first phase of my research and submit my initial findings to the journal that sponsored my work. That will take several more months at minimum. Several months I can manage, Josiah said, relief and joy flooding through him. We can announce our engagement now if you wish, or wait until closer to the wedding, whatever makes you most comfortable. Let us wait, Evangeline decided, not because I'm ashamed, but because I want to give my work the attention it deserves, without constant questions about wedding plans. Once I submit my findings, we can make our announcement and plan properly. They sealed the agreement with a kiss that left both of them breathless and wanting more. Mrs. Carmichael chose that moment to enter the parlor with fresh tea, took one look at their flushed faces, and smiled knowingly. I will just leave this here, she said, setting the tea tray on a side table. And I will remind you both that this is a respectable establishment. Restrain yourselves accordingly. After she swept out, Evangeline and Josiah looked at each other and burst into laughter. Winter deepened, and the snake population went fully dormant. Evangeline spent her days organizing her notes, refining her sketches, and drafting the comprehensive report she would submit to the scientific journal in Boston. Josiah helped where he could, though his contribution was mostly in keeping her supplied with firewood, good food, and encouragement when she became frustrated with the writing process. He also began making plans for their future. His cabin in the high country was suitable for a bachelor surviving alone, but it would not do for a married couple. He started drawing up plans for additions and improvements, imagining how to create space for Evangeline's research without sacrificing the simplicity he valued. He purchased lumber when he could get it and stored it at a friend's property on the outskirts of town, planning to haul it up to the cabin in the spring. Christmas came, and Mrs. Carmichael insisted on a proper celebration with a decorated tree and a feast. It was a small gathering, just the boarders and a few friends from town, but it felt warm and familial in a way Josiah had not experienced since his family's death. Evangeline gave him a beautiful knife she had commissioned from the town blacksmith, the handle carved with mountain scenes. He gave her a necklace made from a bear claw he had collected years ago, strung on a delicate silver chain. "For protection," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "and to remind you that you are as fierce as any predator in these mountains." "I love it," Evangeline said, touching the claw reverently. "I will wear it always." As winter gave way to early spring in March of 1877, Evangeline completed her report and prepared to send it east. The manuscript was over 100 pages long, detailing her observations of rattlesnake behavior, population distributions, and ecological roles. It included dozens of detailed sketches and comprehensive data tables. She packed it carefully and entrusted it to the mail stage, feeling both proud and anxious about how it would be received. "It is excellent work," Josiah assured her. "They would be fools not to publish it." "Academic journals have rejected work by women for less substantive reasons than gender bias," Evangeline said. "But I have done my best. That is all I can control." With her initial research phase complete, they announced their engagement. The news was met with a mixture of reactions in Silver Ridge. Most people were genuinely happy for them, having watched their relationship develop over the winter. A few expressed disapproval, feeling that Evangeline should return to civilization rather than burying herself in the mountains with a rough frontiersman. Mrs. Carmichael silenced the worst of the critics with her formidable personality and unshakable support. They planned a simple wedding for late May, giving Evangeline time to receive word back from the journal and Josiah time to make his cabin livable for two people. As the snow began to melt and the first wildflowers appeared in sheltered valleys, they resumed their expeditions to document the spring emergence of snakes from their winter dens. The massive den site they had found in October was Evangeline's primary focus. She wanted to document the mating behaviors and dispersal patterns as the snakes emerged from dormancy. Josiah built a small blind near the den where they could observe without disturbing the snakes, and they spent long days in patient observation. The sight of hundreds of rattlesnakes emerging from the rocky crevices was both awe-inspiring and slightly terrifying. They formed writhing masses as the males competed for access to females, their bodies intertwining in complex mating balls. Evangeline filled notebook after notebook with observations, her excitement palpable as she witnessed behaviors rarely documented in scientific literature. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, watching a particularly large male successfully court a female. "This level of competitive behavior suggests much more complex social structures than previously believed. This could revolutionize how we understand reptile cognition and behavior." Josiah watched her watching the snakes, seeing the brilliant mind at work, the passion that drove her. He felt proud to be supporting her work and humbled by her trust in him. She had risked everything to come west, to pursue knowledge that most of society deemed unimportant or unseemly for a woman. Her courage inspired him daily. In mid-April, word came from Boston. Evangeline tore open the envelope with trembling hands, hardly daring to hope. Josiah stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder in support, as she read the letter. Her hands began to shake for a different reason as tears spilled down her cheeks. "What does it say?" Josiah asked, alarm flooding through him. "Did they reject it?" "No," Evangeline choked out. "They accepted it. They are publishing it in full in the summer edition. They called it groundbreaking work that significantly advances the field of herpetology. They want more articles. They are offering me an ongoing contract to continue documenting Western snake species." Josiah whooped and spun her around, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. "I told you it was excellent work. They would have been fools to reject it." Evangeline laughed and cried simultaneously, overwhelmed by relief and joy. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, was finally bearing fruit. Her research would be published, her name would be attached to genuine contributions to scientific knowledge, and she had accomplished it on her own terms. "There is more," she said, wiping her eyes and reading further. "They want me to present my findings at a scientific conference in Denver in September. It is a tremendous honor, Josiah. Women are rarely invited to present at such conferences." "Then you must go," Josiah said firmly. "I will take you to Denver myself. We can make it our honeymoon." "A honeymoon to a scientific conference?" Evangeline laughed. "That is the least romantic thing I have ever heard." "Then we will stay extra days and I will show you romantic Denver," Josiah amended. "We will do both. Support your career and celebrate our marriage. It does not have to be one or the other." Evangeline threw her arms around his neck and kissed him soundly. "Have I told you recently that I love you?" "Not in the last few hours," Josiah said with a grin. "Feel free to repeat it as often as you like." The wedding took place on a perfect May morning with the mountains as backdrop. Mrs. Carmichael had transformed the boarding house parlor with wildflowers and ribbons, and the town turned out in surprising numbers to witness the ceremony. Evangeline wore a simple but elegant dress of cream-colored silk that she had ordered from Denver, and Josiah had submitted to a haircut and shave that revealed the strong lines of his face. He wore new buckskins and looked simultaneously civilized and wild, like a mountain cat dressed up for company. The ceremony was brief, conducted by the circuit preacher who passed through Silver Ridge twice a year. Evangeline and Josiah exchanged vows in steady voices, their eyes locked on each other as they promised to love and honor for the rest of their days. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Josiah kissed his bride with a tenderness that made half the women in attendance sigh with envy. The celebration afterward featured food, music, and dancing. Josiah was surprised to discover that Evangeline danced beautifully, her movements graceful and sure. They swirled around Mrs. Carmichael's parlor in a waltz, and he felt like the luckiest man alive. As evening approached, they said their goodbyes and mounted their horses, riding toward the high country and the cabin that would be their home. Josiah had spent weeks preparing for this day, adding a new room for Evangeline's research, installing proper windows, building furniture, and stocking provisions. The cabin was transformed from a bachelor's rough shelter into a genuine home. When they arrived at dusk, Josiah dismounted and lifted Evangeline from her saddle, carrying her across the threshold in the traditional manner. She laughed and kissed him, her arms around his neck. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan," he said, setting her gently on her feet. "Welcome home, Mr. Brennan," she replied, looking around at the cabin with delight. The interior was simple but comfortable. The main room held a stone fireplace, a table with chairs, a small kitchen area, and Josiah's bed piled high with quilts. The new addition held a desk, shelves for books and equipment, and the secure enclosures for Evangeline's snakes, which Josiah had transported up the mountain earlier in the week. Everything spoke of care and thought, of a man who had prepared a space for the woman he loved. "It is perfect," Evangeline said, emotion thickening her voice. "You built this for me." "For us," Josiah corrected. "This is our home now, yours and mine together." That night they consummated their marriage with a passion that had been building for months. Josiah was gentle and patient, attuned to Evangeline's inexperience, and determined to make their first joining something beautiful. Evangeline responded to his touch with wonder and growing confidence, discovering the pleasure that could be found in physical intimacy with someone you loved and trusted completely. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the large bed, moonlight streaming through the window and casting silver light across their joined bodies. Evangeline traced patterns on Josiah's chest, marveling at the solidity of him, the strength that was now hers to rely upon. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she confessed. "I thought choosing science meant choosing loneliness. I thought I had to sacrifice one to have the other." "You never have to choose," Josiah assured her, his fingers combing through her unbound hair. "We will build a life that includes both your work and our love. It may not be a conventional life, but when have either of us been conventional?" "Never," Evangeline admitted with a laugh. "I suppose we are well matched in our unconventionality." They settled into married life with surprising ease. The rhythm of their days found a natural balance between Evangeline's research and the practical demands of mountain living. Josiah hunted and trapped, providing meat and furs, while Evangeline tended a garden, prepared meals, and continued documenting snake populations throughout the spring and summer. They worked side by side on many tasks, comfortable in each other's company, whether talking or simply sharing silence. The isolation that had once suited Josiah's solitary nature felt different with Evangeline present. The cabin was filled with life and purpose in ways it never had been before. Evangeline's snake collection grew as she studied various species, and Josiah found himself becoming genuinely interested in the creatures he had previously regarded with caution or indifference. She taught him to appreciate the elegant efficiency of their designs, the vital roles they played in the ecosystem. In late July, a young man arrived at their cabin carrying a letter for Evangeline. He was a messenger from Silver Ridge, sent by Mrs. Carmichael, who knew the matter was urgent. The letter was from the scientific journal, and Evangeline read it with growing astonishment. "They published my article early," she told Josiah. "It generated such enthusiasm that they moved up the publication date, and now there are letters from other scientists asking questions, requesting additional data, wanting to collaborate. Josiah, my work is being taken seriously. People are citing my research." She showed him the letters, her hands shaking with excitement. Among them was a formal invitation to present at the Denver conference and a request to write a comprehensive book about western rattlesnakes for a scientific publishing house. "A book," Evangeline said. "They want me to write a book. This is beyond anything I imagined." Josiah pulled her into his arms, sharing her joy. "You have earned this recognition," he said. "Your work is exceptional, Evangeline. The scientific community would be foolish not to embrace it." As summer faded into autumn, they prepared for the trip to Denver. Josiah arranged for a friend to check on the cabin and feed Evangeline snakes in their absence, and they packed carefully for the journey. The trip would take several days each way, but both were looking forward to the adventure. Denver in September of 1877 was a bustling city, a far cry from the quiet mountains where they made their home. The streets were crowded with wagons and pedestrians, the buildings tall and imposing after months in their cabin. Evangeline felt slightly overwhelmed by the noise and activity, but Josiah's steady presence beside her provided an anchor. The scientific conference was held in a grand hotel, and Evangeline found herself surrounded by men in formal suits discussing theories and methodologies. She was one of only 3 women presenting research, and the only one focusing on reptiles. Some of the male scientists regarded her with skepticism or condescension, but her presentation was so thorough and well documented that even the skeptics were forced to acknowledge the quality of her work. Josiah sat in the back of the lecture hall, watching his wife command the room with her knowledge and passion. He saw the respect she earned through sheer competence, the way even the dismissive scientists leaned forward to better hear her descriptions of rattlesnake behavior. Pride swelled in his chest so intensely it almost hurt. After her presentation, Evangeline was mobbed with questions and requests for further information. She handled it all with grace and confidence, her scientific mind sharp and her explanations clear. Several prominent scientists invited her to collaborate on future research, and the publisher representative confirmed their interest in the book project. That evening, Josiah took her to a fine restaurant to celebrate. They dressed in their best clothes, Evangeline in a green silk gown that matched her eyes, and Josiah in a suit that made him look almost civilized. Over an excellent dinner, they toasted her success with champagne. "To Dr. Evangeline Brennan," Josiah said, raising his glass. "Though you may not have the official title yet, you have earned it through your work." "To us," Evangeline corrected, clinking her glass against his, "to building a life that includes both love and science, to proving that a woman can have both without sacrificing either." They stayed in Denver for 3 more days, exploring the city and enjoying their time away from the demands of daily life. Josiah bought her books from a large bookstore, scientific texts she had mentioned wanting. Evangeline bought him a fine new rifle and a pocket watch. They went to the theater and walked through parks and simply enjoyed being together in a different setting. But both were secretly relieved when it was time to return to the mountains. The city was interesting, but it was not home. Home was their cabin with its smoking chimney and stunning views, with the creek gurgling past and the elk bugling in the meadows. They arrived back in late September to find their cabin exactly as they had left it, the snakes healthy and the mountain preparing for winter. The aspens were gold, and the air held the crisp promise of snow. They settled back into their routines with contentment, both recognizing how fortunate they were to have found not just love, but partnership. Winter came early and stayed late that year. Snow piled high around the cabin, and they were isolated for weeks at a time. But the isolation felt cozy rather than oppressive. Evangeline worked on her book manuscript, writing by lamplight while Josiah carved or read aloud from the books they owned. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other more deeply with each passing day. In January of 1878, during a particularly fierce blizzard, Evangeline realized she was pregnant. The signs were unmistakable, though she waited a few more weeks to be certain before telling Josiah. When she finally shared the news, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms, his face transformed with joy. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Evangeline asked, suddenly nervous. "I know we have not discussed children yet." "Happy does not begin to cover it," Josiah assured her, terrified, overjoyed, overwhelmed, but mostly happy beyond measure. They began planning immediately, discussing how to prepare for a child in their remote location. Josiah insisted they spend the last month of Evangeline's pregnancy in Silver Ridge, where she would have access to a doctor and help if complications arose. Evangeline agreed, though she hated the thought of leaving their cabin. Spring came, and the mountains exploded with new life. Evangeline's pregnancy progressed normally, and she continued her research as long as she could manage the physical demands. She documented the spring snake emergence again, adding new data to her growing manuscript. The book was nearly complete, and she was determined to finish it before the baby arrived. In July, they reluctantly packed up and headed down to Silver Ridge. Mrs. Carmichael welcomed them with open arms and fussed over Evangeline like a mother hen. The older woman had become dear to both of them, a surrogate family in a place far from their origins. The baby, a boy they named Samuel after Josiah's father, arrived in early August after a long but uncomplicated labor. Josiah held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overcome by the rush of love for this tiny human they had created together. "He is perfect," Josiah whispered, his large hands cradling the infant with exquisite gentleness. "Evangeline, he is absolutely perfect." Evangeline, exhausted but elated, watched her husband fall in love with their son. "He has your eyes," she observed, "that same glacier blue." They stayed in Silver Ridge for 6 weeks, giving Evangeline time to recover and Samuel time to grow stronger before the journey back to the cabin. Evangeline finished her book manuscript during those weeks, working in the quiet hours when Samuel slept. She sent it off to the publisher with a sense of completion and pride. When they finally returned to their mountain home, it felt like a homecoming in the truest sense. The cabin welcomed them back, and they settled into a new rhythm that included caring for an infant. Josiah proved to be a devoted father, changing diapers and walking a fussy baby with the same patient competence he brought to everything else. Evangeline discovered she could balance motherhood and her scientific work, though it required careful time management. She conducted shorter expeditions close to the cabin, often with Samuel strapped to her back in a carrier Josiah had fashioned. Her son grew up surrounded by the mountains and by snakes, learning from infancy that both could be beautiful rather than frightening. The years passed in a blur of love and work and family. Evangeline's book on western rattlesnakes was published to critical acclaim in 1879, establishing her reputation as one of the foremost herpetologists in the country. She continued to publish articles and conduct research, though she focused on projects that could be completed close to home while Samuel was young. In 1881, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Catherine after Evangeline's mother. She had her mother's auburn hair and quick mind, and from the moment she could walk she was getting into everything, exploring the world with fearless curiosity. Josiah built additions to the cabin as their family grew, creating more space for children and research. The home became a unique blend of wilderness living and scientific pursuit, with snake enclosures sharing space with children's toys and academic journals stacked beside hunting equipment. They traveled to Denver occasionally for scientific conferences, bringing the children along and making adventures of the trips. Samuel and Catherine grew up comfortable in both wilderness and civilization, equally at ease tracking deer with their father and attending lectures with their mother. The scientific community gradually accepted Evangeline not just as a competent researcher, but as a leading expert in her field. She received invitations to speak at universities and was consulted on matters of reptile conservation, but she never forgot the struggles she had faced or the skepticism she had overcome, and she made it her mission to mentor other women interested in scientific careers. In 1885, a third child joined the family, another boy they named Thomas. He was quieter than his siblings, but equally curious, with a particular fascination for his mother's snakes that delighted Evangeline. All three children grew up without fear of snakes, understanding them as their mother did, as complex creatures worthy of respect rather than subjects of horror. Josiah continued to trap and hunt, providing for his growing family and maintaining his connection to the wilderness he loved. But his life was richer now, filled with the laughter of children and the intellectual stimulation of his brilliant wife. He never regretted the choice to marry Evangeline, never felt constrained by family obligations. Instead, he felt completed, as though he had been waiting his entire life for this particular woman and these particular children. The years brought challenges as well as joys. There were harsh winters when supplies ran low, and illness when the doctor was days away. There were conflicts with the changing frontier as more settlers arrived and wildlife populations shifted. There were setbacks in Evangeline's research and disappointments in the scientific community's slow progress toward accepting women as equals. But through it all, Josiah and Evangeline faced life together, partners in every sense of the word. They supported each other's dreams and shared each other's burdens. They taught their children that love and respect formed the foundation of any successful relationship, and that pursuing one's passions was not just acceptable, but essential to a life well lived. In 1890, on a golden September afternoon, much like the one when Evangeline had first arrived in Silver Ridge 14 years earlier, the Brennan family gathered on the porch of their mountain cabin. Samuel was 12, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's quick intelligence. Catherine was 9, all fire and determination, already declaring her intention to become a doctor. Thomas was 5, quiet and observant, usually found with a book or following his mother on her research expeditions. Josiah sat in a handmade rocking chair, Thomas on his lap, while Evangeline leaned against the porch rail, watching Samuel and Catherine play with a harmless garter snake they had found near the creek. The scene was peaceful and perfect, a snapshot of the life they had built together through love and hard work and unwavering commitment to each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Josiah asked suddenly. "Coming west, marrying me, choosing this life over what you could have had in Boston?" Evangeline turned to look at him, her green eyes soft with love. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, this partnership we have built is worth more than any recognition or prestige I could have achieved alone. You showed me that I did not have to choose between science and love, that I could have both if I was willing to forge my own path." "You forged that path yourself," Josiah said. "I just walked it beside you." "And that made all the difference," Evangeline said, crossing to sit on the arm of his chair and rest her hand on his shoulder. "Everything I have accomplished, everything I am, is better because you are in my life." Samuel looked up from the snake he was examining. "Are you two being mushy again?" he asked with the exasperation of a 12-year-old. "Yes," Josiah said unrepentantly. "Get used to it." Catherine giggled and Thomas snuggled deeper into his father's lap, content in the safety of his family. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Evangeline looked out over the mountains that had become her home and felt profound gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought her here. She thought about the frightened but determined young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach carrying a rattlesnake and facing a town full of skepticism and fear. She thought about the mountain man who had seen past the scandal to the courage beneath, who had defended her when she had no other allies. She thought about all the days and years between then and now, the challenges overcome and the joys discovered. "They shrieked when they saw my snakes," Evangeline said softly, remembering that first day. "And I said you were not afraid of nothing," Josiah finished, the memory bringing a smile to his weathered face. "I was right, you know. You have never been afraid of anything that mattered." "I was afraid of loving you," Evangeline admitted, "afraid of wanting something beyond my research, beyond my professional ambitions, afraid of losing myself in someone else." "Did you?" Josiah asked. "Lose yourself?" "No," Evangeline said, looking at her husband and her children, at the life they had built together in these mountains. "I found myself, the truest, fullest version of myself, because you never asked me to be anything other than who I am." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the mountain sky, the Brennan family moved inside to warmth and lamplight. Josiah built up the fire while Evangeline prepared dinner, the children helping or hindering in equal measure. The cabin was filled with love and laughter, with the messy reality of family life in all its imperfect perfection. Later, after the children were tucked into their beds and the cabin had settled into quiet, Josiah and Evangeline sat together by the fire as they had done countless evenings before. Evangeline was reviewing notes for her next article while Josiah worked on a new knife handle he was carving. The silence between them was comfortable, the companionship of two people who no longer needed words to communicate. "I love you," Josiah said suddenly, looking up from his carving. Evangeline smiled, the expression transforming her face from serious to radiant. "I love you too. Every single day, more than the day before." "Even when I track mud on your research notes?" Josiah asked with a teasing glint in his eye. "Even then," Evangeline confirmed, "though I would appreciate if you would try to avoid it in the future." They went to bed as the fire died to embers, wrapped in each other's arms in the darkness. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the love story that had unfolded in their shadow. A love story between a woman who kept snakes and a mountain man who saw her courage. A love story that proved passion and partnership could coexist, that pursuing one's dreams did not mean sacrificing love, that two people from different worlds could build something beautiful together if they were willing to meet each other halfway. The rattlesnakes in Evangeline's enclosures coiled contentedly in their heated boxes, safe and studied, contributing to scientific knowledge that would help their wild cousins survive in a changing world. The children slept peacefully in their beds, secure in the love of parents who had shown them that being different was not something to fear, but something to celebrate. And Josiah and Evangeline held each other through the night, grateful beyond measure for the day a woman with snakes had stepped off a stagecoach and changed both their lives forever. Years continued to pass, bringing both expected and unexpected changes. Samuel grew into a young man with his father's strength and his mother's intellectual curiosity. He surprised them by announcing his intention to study veterinary medicine, wanting to combine his love of animals with practical healing skills. Evangeline and Josiah supported his decision wholeheartedly, proud of the thoughtful man their son had become. Catherine pursued her medical ambitions with characteristic determination, shocking many in Silver Ridge by insisting she would attend medical school regardless of whether it was considered appropriate for women. She had inherited her mother's refusal to accept limitations based on gender, and Evangeline mentored her daughter with the same fierce support her own mother had once provided. Thomas remained the quietest of the three children, but his still waters ran deep. He became his mother's most dedicated assistant in her research, developing an almost preternatural ability to locate and handle snakes. By the time he was 10, he could identify every species in Montana Territory by sight and was contributing observations to his mother's published work. In 1895, Evangeline published her second book, A Comprehensive Guide to All Reptiles of the American West. It became a standard reference text used by naturalists and scientists throughout the country. She was invited to speak at Harvard, the very institution that had once refused to allow her to formally attend classes because of her gender. The irony was not lost on her as she stood before an auditorium full of students and delivered a lecture on reptile conservation that was met with a standing ovation. Josiah accompanied her to Boston, his first trip to the East since before his family's death. He found the city overwhelming, but endured it for Evangeline's sake, taking pride in watching her receive the recognition she so richly deserved. They visited her father, now elderly and living quietly in the suburbs. The reunion was cordial, if not warm, her father finally acknowledging that his daughter's unconventional choices had led to remarkable achievements. But both were relieved to board the train back west, eager to return to their mountain home. Montana Territory was where they belonged, where their hearts and their family waited. The mountains had shaped them and held them, providing the freedom and space they needed to become their truest selves. In 1897, Montana achieved statehood, and the Brennan family celebrated along with their neighbors. The frontier was changing, becoming more settled and civilized, but the high country where they lived remained relatively untouched. Josiah and Evangeline were grateful for that, for the wilderness that had brought them together and continued to sustain them. The turn of the century found the Brennan family thriving. Samuel had graduated from veterinary school and opened a practice in Helena, where he treated everything from household pets to ranch horses. He married a gentlewoman named Claire, who shared his love of animals, and they soon had children of their own, making Josiah and Evangeline grandparents. Catherine was attending medical school in Chicago, one of the few women in her class and fighting daily battles against prejudice and skepticism. But she persevered with the stubbornness she had inherited from both parents, determined to prove herself through competence and dedication. Her letters home were filled with frustration and triumph in equal measure, and Evangeline wrote back with encouragement and advice drawn from her own experiences. Thomas remained at home, now 17, and his mother's full research partner. He had developed his own area of expertise in snake venom and its potential medical applications, conducting careful experiments that expanded the family's scientific contributions. He published his first solo paper at 16, earning respect from the scientific community despite his youth. Josiah, now 51, still trapped and hunted though he had slowed slightly with age. His hair was gray now, his face lined with the years, but he remained strong and capable. He took immense pride in his children and their accomplishments, in the family he and Evangeline had raised together. Evangeline, at 44, was still conducting research and writing, though she focused more on conservation efforts now than pure documentation. She had watched the wilderness shrink as settlement expanded, and she worked tirelessly to establish protected areas where native species could survive undisturbed. Her reputation lent weight to her advocacy, and she successfully lobbied for several significant conservation measures. On a cool October evening in 1900, the extended Brennan family gathered at the mountain cabin for a reunion. Samuel and Claire brought their 2 young children. Catherine came home from medical school for a brief visit. Thomas was there, of course, along with Mrs. Carmichael, who had made the journey from Silver Ridge despite her advanced age. Other friends from town joined them, people who had become family over the years. The cabin and its additions were filled to bursting with people, laughter, and love. Children ran through the rooms while adults caught up on news and shared stories. A long table was laden with food, and the fire roared in the hearth. It was chaotic and perfect, a celebration of life and family and the bonds that held them all together. As evening deepened into night, Josiah and Evangeline slipped outside for a moment of quiet. They stood on the porch, arms around each other, looking out at the stars that blazed overhead in the clear mountain air. "Did you ever imagine this?" Evangeline asked softly. "When you were alone in these mountains, did you imagine a day when your home would be filled with children and grandchildren?" "Never," Josiah admitted. "I thought I would die alone up here, and I had made my peace with that. Then you stepped off that stagecoach with your snakes and your courage, and everything changed." "The best things in life are the ones we never see coming," Evangeline mused. "If someone had told me when I left Boston that I would end up married to a mountain man, raising children in the wilderness while conducting groundbreaking research, I would have thought they were insane." "Are you happy?" Josiah asked, the same question he had asked years ago. "Profoundly, completely, impossibly happy," Evangeline said. Every day with you is a gift, Josiah. Every challenge we have overcome, every joy we have shared, every moment of this life we have built together is exactly what I needed, even when I did not know I needed it." She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his bearded face in her hands. "You saw me when others only saw something to fear or mock. You supported my dreams when others told me to abandon them. You loved me, not despite my strangeness, but because of it. How could I be anything but happy?" Josiah kissed her then, as deeply and passionately as he had on their wedding day. The years had changed them both, adding gray hair and wrinkles and the comfortable weight of age, but the love between them had only grown stronger. They had built something rare and precious, a partnership of equals who brought out the best in each other. From inside the cabin, a child's laughter rang out, followed by Thomas calling for them. They broke apart reluctantly and went back inside to their family, to the warmth and chaos and love that filled every corner of their home. As the night wore on, and eventually people began to drift toward beds and bedrolls, Evangeline found herself standing in her research room, looking at the snake enclosures that had caused such scandal all those years ago. She thought about the young woman she had been, stepping off that stagecoach with a rattlesnake wrapped around her wrist and determination in her heart. She had wanted to be taken seriously as a scientist, to contribute to human knowledge, to prove that a woman could pursue academic excellence without apology. She had achieved all that and more, her published works now referenced in universities around the world, her name known and respected in scientific circles. But what she had not anticipated, what she had not even known to want, was the love and family that had grown alongside her professional accomplishments. Josiah had shown her that she did not have to choose, that life could be rich and full in multiple dimensions if she was willing to embrace all of it. She heard his step behind her and turned to find him watching her from the doorway, his pale eyes warm with understanding. "Remembering?" he asked. "Always," Evangeline said, "remembering and being grateful. For the snakes that brought me here, for the mountain man who defended me, for every moment that led to this." "She keeps snakes as pets," they shrieked, Josiah quoted, moving to stand beside her. "Good. She ain't afraid of nothing, you said," Evangeline finished. "And you were right. Not about me being unafraid because I was terrified of so many things, but you gave me the courage to face those fears, to believe I could have everything I wanted if I was willing to fight for it." "We gave each other courage," Josiah corrected. "You taught me that being alone was not the same as being strong, that opening my heart to love did not make me weak. We saved each other, Evangeline." They stood together in the quiet room, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the evidence of her life's work, and understood the profound truth of that statement. They had saved each other, two lonely people who had found completion in their union. The years ahead would bring more changes, more challenges, and more joys. Catherine would become a pioneering woman doctor, treating patients in Chicago who could not afford care from more established physicians. Samuel would expand his veterinary practice and develop innovative treatments for livestock diseases. Thomas would eventually join his mother's conservation work, becoming a leading voice for wildlife protection in the early 20th century. Josiah and Evangeline would grow old together in their mountain cabin, still conducting research and welcoming grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. They would watch the world change around them, civilization creeping ever closer, but they would maintain their sanctuary in the high country where they had first found each other. When Josiah finally passed away in 1918 at the age of 72, it was peacefully in his sleep with Evangeline, holding his hand. She mourned deeply, but also celebrated a life well lived, a love fully expressed, a partnership that had enriched both their lives immeasurably. She lived another 8 years, dying at 71 with her children and grandchildren around her, her final words a whispered, "I love you," to the husband she would soon join. But on this perfect October night in 1900, with their family sleeping peacefully under their roof and their love as strong as ever, Josiah and Evangeline Brennan stood together in the mountain cabin that had become home and simply held each other. Outside, the mountains stood eternal. Inside, love warmed every corner. The snake that had caused such commotion that first day, long since released back into the wild, was somewhere in those mountains preparing for winter sleep. Evangeline liked to imagine She occasionally saw that same snake basking on familiar rocks, though she knew the odds were slim. It did not matter. What mattered was that one snake, one moment of courage, one mountain man's defense had changed everything. From scandal to acceptance, from loneliness to love, from uncertainty to absolute conviction that this was exactly where they were meant to be. Their story was one of courage and partnership, of refusing to accept society's limitations, of building a life that honored both individual passions and shared love. As they finally went to bed, climbing the ladder to the loft they still shared after 23 years of marriage, Evangeline took one last look around at the home they had built. Everything in it told their story. The scientific equipment and the hunting gear, the children's old toys and the academic journals, the snake enclosures and the handmade furniture. It was a perfect representation of their lives, a beautiful chaos that made complete sense because they had created it together. "Good night, my love," Josiah murmured, pulling her close. "Good night," Evangeline replied, fitting herself against his familiar warmth. "Thank you for seeing me." "Thank you for being worth seeing," Josiah countered. "Now sleep. Tomorrow comes early." And so they slept as they had slept for thousands of nights before, wrapped around each other in the mountain cabin where they belonged. The woman who kept snakes and the mountain man who loved her, partners in every sense, living proof that the best love stories are the ones where both people become more fully themselves through their union. The end came not with drama, but with peace, with satisfaction, with the deep contentment of lives well lived and love fully expressed. And if sometimes in the mountains of Montana people claim to see a ghostly couple riding through the high country, a tall man with long hair and a woman with auburn hair carrying something that might be a snake, well, perhaps some love stories never really end. Perhaps they simply become part of the land itself, woven into the mountains and the sky, eternal as the wilderness that witnessed their beginning. This was the story of Evangeline Thorne and Josiah Brennan, the scientist and the mountain man, who proved that courage comes in many forms and love grows strongest when both people are free to be completely, authentically themselves. From that first shrieking encounter to their final peaceful days, they built something rare and beautiful. A partnership that enriched science, raised remarkable children, and demonstrated that following your heart and following your dreams need not be mutually exclusive choices. They lived, they loved, they left the world better than they found it. What more could anyone ask from a life well lived? And it all began because she kept snakes as pets. They shrieked, and a mountain man said, "Good, she ain't afraid of nothing." In the end, that simple moment of recognition and respect changed two lives forever and created a love story for the ages.